Well, hello scrappers, Mike here. Welcome back to my channel. And look up on my bench, I've got my big bucket of IC chips dumped over. Um, just so you can see what I'm working with here. You know me, you watch my channel at all, you know I love IC chips. I get a lot of gold and silver out of IC chips. And I have a lot of videos on how to do that on this channel. You look for them. I'll put a link to a series in the upper right on the entire process from start to finish on how I get gold and silver out of IC chips. Now, it's taken me a lot of years and a lot of trial and error to come up with a method to get the gold and silver out of these because they're a pretty low grade source of gold and silver. Now, compared to the ore they're pulling out of the ground these days, they're pretty high grade, but it takes a lot of processing to get the material out of them. It's not that easy. Like I said, a lot of trial and error went into it, and maybe a little more error than I would really like to admit. But in the end, I've got a process that works. Works for me anyway. Other people tell me that the process works for them too. They follow my methods. All fine and good. Okay. So, what's going on today? Well, I started getting some strange emails and video comments, a week or two ago. And I'm like, what is this all about? Things like, you won, he lost. You did it, others couldn't. And I'm like, what? What is this about? Finally, I got contacted by a fellow named Joe, who explained what was going on. Joe had sent some IC chips to Sreetips to process. And apparently Sreetips had a lot of trouble with them. And in the end, he kind of gave up. After seeing Joe's message, I went and watched Sreetips videos because I hadn't seen them. I had no idea that this was what was going on. And Sreetips seemed to be operating outside of his comfort zone almost from the very beginning, which is understandable because let's face it, Sreetips is the absolute master when it comes to dealing with jewelry, jeweler's waste, sterling silver, and some other stuff. Okay, I don't know of anybody who does it better. And on the few occasions I have dealt with jewelry, I've used his methods and it's worked great. Yeah. But obviously e-waste is a little bit outside of his comfort zone, especially this kind of stuff right here. He seemed to be having trouble almost from the very beginning, and in the end he basically gave up. But he wasn't that far off the mark. I think with just a few changes to his process, he could have recovered enough gold to at least calculate a yield, and probably enough silver to calculate a yield too. He just got a little bit frustrated and took a few shortcuts that maybe he shouldn't have, and it led to a big mess in the end. So in this video, what I want to do is I want to sort of explain all the steps in my process and compare and contrast that with what Sreetips did in his videos. Now, I'm not going to use any stills or clips from Sreetips videos because I don't have permission to, okay? So if you want to see his videos, I'll link to them down in the description of this video. You can go watch them. But wait, watch this video first, or at least come back and watch the rest of it if you go and watch his videos. But yeah, eventually go watch his videos so you can see what I'm talking about. Because like I said, I'm not going to use any clips or stills from his videos. But yeah, he had a lot of issues pretty much from the get-go. So let's take a look at all the steps in my process that I use to get the gold and silver out of this stuff. And then we'll contrast that with what Sreetips did. All right, so here's all the steps I go through in my process. Delegging, incineration, crushing, sieving, gravity separation, nitric acid extractions, aqua regia extractions, vacuum filtration, gold recovery, silver recovery. Now, Sreetips did most of these. Let's take a look at this in detail. Okay, first step is delegging. I do chemical delegging. Basically, I soak the IC chips in an AP solution with a bubbler, sometimes for months if the weather's cold, but usually it only takes a few weeks if it's nice and warm, and the legs are all gone. That's a lot less junk base metal to have to deal with. Let's take a look at some of my delegged chips I deal with. So yeah, the mix of chips that Joe provided as Sreetips looked really good to me. I could see there were a lot of BGA RAM chips in there. I mean, you look through my stuff here, there's not a lot of RAM chips here. These are mostly dual inline packages, which I would say these are amongst the lowest of the low grade for gold from IC chips, but that's not going to stop me from processing them. I know I can get gold and silver out of these, just not as much as the stuff that Joe provided as Sreetips. I know there's some other stuff in here. There's some flat packs down in here somewhere. And there's some RAM chips down there. The smaller chips tend to be on the bottom. Yeah, there they are. They're in there. But, oh, there's a flat pack. So these are a little better. But anyway, that mix of chips that Joe provided Sreetips with should have provided a lot of gold and silver if properly processed. Okay, they looked like they were chemically delegged, kind of like mine are. You've probably seen my chemical delegging process just to get rid of a lot of the useless junk metal on them before I do anything else with them. Correct me if I'm wrong, Joe. Were the ones you provided Sreetips, were they chemically delegged? They certainly looked like it. They can be mechanically delegged too. There's other ways, but that just helps. That just helps get all of this, junk metal on these legs out of the way, because there's no value to it. There's a little bit of tin, a little bit of copper, a lot of iron, steel, but really no value to that stuff other than that. Now, the chips that Sreetips had looked like they were chemically delegged to me. So again, Joe, let me know in the comments, was that how it was done? But they definitely looked delegged, and they looked like a really good mix of chips that I think Sreetips should have got a fair amount of gold and silver from. Okay, next step, incineration. I've used several different methods of incineration over the years. Some of them fairly complicated. Lately, I've kind of settled on just heating up a Dutch oven to red heat over my foundry furnace, dumping the chips in, stirring them good until they're all ashed nicely. Sreetips, well, he incinerated them too. And even though he seemed a little frustrated with how long it was taking and having to run them through his electric oven twice, he seemed to get a really good incineration. It looked like they were well ashed. Didn't look like there was a lot of carbon there, so I think he did a good job of incineration. He's not really set up for processing bulk IC chips, so I think that's why he got a little frustrated with how long it took. Next up, crushing. Well, I crushed them with a ball mill. I use a ball mill, a homemade ball mill. I have videos on how I make my ball mill. I like the ball mill because it will crush material that is crushable into a very, very, very fine powder. Doesn't affect the metal like gold. That just kind of gets flattened. But the rest of the material gets crushed into a very, very fine powder, which will come in handy at a later step, which we'll talk about down the road. Now, Sreetips crushed his stuff too. He used a blender. Nothing wrong with that. It doesn't quite work as well as my ball mill, but hey, I got started with a blender. I've still got the old Waring blender out in my workshop, and I pull it out from time to time for small jobs too. But I usually, when I'm doing IC chips, I'm doing large batches of them, and I use my ball mill. It works so much better, and it's more hands-off. I can just load up the ball mill, walk away, and do other stuff while it's doing its thing. Sieving. I take the material out of the ball mill after crushing, and I sieve it, and I get out all, or as much as possible, of the junk metal that's left. Because even if you take the legs off the outside of the IC chip, there's still part of the legs going into the package, and there's an internal framework of metal. So, yeah, there's still a lot of metal there, even after taking the legs off, and sieving gets rid of it. So, I use a miner sieve that's fairly fine, but well, Sreetips looked like he was using a kitchen sieve, which was probably plenty fine enough for the job. So up till now, Sreetips has been doing great. Clearly, he seemed to be working outside his comfort zone and was a little bit frustrated at times, but he's doing great. He's on the right track. Next step is gravity separation. And if you watch my videos, you see me do that. I'll take a bucket of the fine powder from the ball mill after sieving out all of the junk metal, and I'll fill that bucket up 3/4 of the way with water or so, and stir it up really good with my paint stirrer, and I'll add some jet dry to it to break up the surface tension of the water, and I'll just let it sit for 10 minutes or so, and then I'll pour that water off into another bucket so I don't lose anything. And a lot of the really fine stuff that I don't want will go away with the water because I crushed it really fine with my ball mill. That stuff will stay suspended in the water column for a long time, so I can get rid of it. And I'll just keep doing this. I will fill the bucket up with water again, stir it up really good, let it sit for a little bit, then dump the water off. And I will keep doing this until basically the water's coming off clear. And I will have gotten rid of probably 90% or more of the material that I started out with. But what's going to be left in the bucket is the heavy stuff. You know, there's going to be a few pieces that didn't get crushed really small, so they're kind of big and heavy, but there's also going to be the gold. The gold is the heaviest thing there. It's got, you know, specific gravity 19 times heavier than water, so it's going to sink to the bottom of the bucket every time when I'm doing the gravity separation. And when I pour that water off, the gold stays behind and it gets concentrated. It gets very concentrated. By the time I'm done, usually the material that comes out after my gravity separation, if I put it in a beaker and swirl it around a little bit, I can actually see the gold in the beaker. Okay, it'll concentrate, you know, either in the center of the beaker if I'm swirling it in a circle, or if I'm agitating it at an angle, it'll settle to one side and you can see the gold there. So, you know, before we've even done any kind of extractions, after the gravity separation, the gold is very concentrated. Okay, Sreetips did not do a gravity separation, and that left him with a whole lot more material to try to deal with. And that is not a fun time to try and deal with that much material. Really, the gravity separation is kind of an essential step as far as I'm concerned. And there's multiple ways to do it. You could do it my way with the buckets, or you could do it the way my friend Jim does it. He uses a poop tube sluice, and he runs his material through that, and that concentrates the gold. So, you know, there's lots of different ways to do the gravity separation and just get rid of, you know, 90% or more of that absolute crap that's there. The pulverized IC chip remains, the silica dye material, the ash material, any carbon that's left after incineration, all that stuff goes away with the gravity separation, and you're left with a much smaller amount of material that's highly concentrated. So yeah, I think next time Sreetips does IC chips, he should consider doing a gravity separation to reduce the amount of material he has to work with and concentrate the gold and silver. Next are nitric acid extractions. I always do a nitric acid extraction. Sometimes it's just poor man's nitric, a little sulfuric acid and a nitrate salt, potassium nitrate or sodium nitrate. That works great too. The nitric acid extractions will dissolve the base metals out of what's left after the gravity separation, because there's going to be some base metals there. There's going to be some small bits of steel. There's going to be copper, probably some nickel. There's going to be tin. You know, all this stuff needs to be removed. Every step in this process is basically an extraction of some point. With delegging, I'm extracting the legs. With incineration, I'm extracting the plastic. You know, crushing is not really an extraction process, but the sieving, you know, extracts a lot of junk metal. The gravity separation extracts just garbage. And the nitric acid extractions are going to extract the base metals. After the nitric acid extractions, you're pretty much just left with silica dye material and your gold. Everything else has been removed from the material. And also the nitric acid extractions are where I get the silver from. I will keep the spent nitric acid, and it's usually not even spent. I can save it and use it on the next batch. And this nitric acid becomes concentrated in silver over time. And that's where I'll get my silver from. I'll filter that liquid, and I'll usually just cement out the silver on copper after the nitric acid extractions. Now, Sreetips, he started out doing the right thing. He did a small sample. He took a small sample out of that kilo of material, and he started doing a nitric acid extraction on it. Even though he hadn't done a gravity separation, He was on the right track here with his nitric acid extraction. But then he got a little frustrated and he combined his small batch with the rest of the material and didn't bother doing a nitric acid extraction on the bulk of the material. So basically, what he wound up with is essentially no extraction at all. So he had material there that was still full of base metals of all kinds. And that is not what you want to go to Aqua Regia with, especially not when there is such a bulk of material there. There's just so much material in his beakers that when he went to Aqua Regia, well, we'll talk about that in a second. So what does Aqua Regia do for you? Well, I do an Aqua Regia extraction. I actually usually do at least 2 on the material. I'll do a first one, and then I'll do a second one. So Aqua Regia basically dissolves the gold. And by the time I get to this point, there's nothing left in there to dissolve except the gold. There might be traces of the base metals in there. Sometimes I don't wash the material. I'll wash the material between the nitric acid extractions and the Aqua Regia extractions, try and get as much of the base metal salts out of it as I can. Sometimes I haven't done a really good nitric acid extraction, or I haven't washed it good enough, and my Aqua Regia will come out a little green. But, you know, I'm used to that. Just a little bit of dirty greenness to the Aqua Regia, not a problem. You're still going to have not too much trouble dropping gold out of it. Now, Sreetips, he went straight to Aqua Regia without really a good gravity separation or a good nitric acid extraction. He had way too much material in those beakers. The nitric acid didn't have a chance to really get in good contact with it. The thing about nitric acid, and in fact all acids, including Aqua Regia, is it's going to preferentially attack base metals because they are much more reactive than the gold. Also, his nitric acid extraction was inadequate, and it probably did not remove most of the silver, just because there was so much material there, and it did not have a chance for the acids to contact most of the material, and there was so much other base metal there, more reactive, the silver would have been left behind. So when he gets to Aqua Regia, he's got the same issue. He's got too much material in his beakers. He's not getting good contact between the acid and the material. There's a lot of base metal still in there, I believe. I mean, from the color of the Aqua Regia, that is clear. There was a lot of base metal in there. And probably did not dissolve most of the gold. Okay? Probably not. I just can't see that happening. The Aqua Regia was going to preferentially attack the base metals, and since there was so much material in there, I don't think he got rid of all the base metals, and probably only part of the gold was dissolved. Okay, my next step is vacuum filtration, which, you know, is really nice because, you know, even after all these other steps, there's still a fair amount of fine material left over, and the filter plugs up pretty quickly. So vacuum filtration, that speeds things up something wonderful. Well, Sreetips did a vacuum filtration too, but he had so much material. My goodness. His filters were full to the brim, and that vacuum filtration must have taken him a very long time. I'd have to go back and watch the video again because he used a little clock going generally while he's doing stuff, and you can see sometimes that things take him hours. I'll bet that vacuum filtration took him hours, although I didn't really, time it by the clock. But okay, so vacuum filtration, that worked. Okay, so next, I'll do gold recovery. And at this point, I can do something like just add some SMB to the filtered Aqua Regia and the gold will drop out. Or I can add some iron sulfate to it and the gold will drop out. Either way, it works great. At this point, I get my gold. And it's usually pretty clean gold. Might be a trace of silver chloride in the solution. I might have to filter it a couple of times to get the silver chloride out of it before I drop the gold, but usually it's a pretty clean gold drop. Okay? Well, Sreetips' gold drop was anything but clean. He had way too much nitric acid in there. and he spent a long time trying to neutralize that nitric acid, both by adding massive quantities of SMB and by adding sulfamic acid to it to try and denox that material. Now, Sreetips is generally pretty conservative with his nitric acid when it comes to dissolving gold. I mean, there is, and I was not aware of this until recently, there's actually a Sreetips drinking game making the rounds of some of the refining forums. Basically, every time Sreetips said, I'm going to add another shot of nitric acid, you're supposed to take a shot of your favorite libation, and the goal is to not be passed out on the floor before the end of the video. But on the whole, Sreetips a lot of times is very conservative with his additions of nitric acid. Not this time. He was really laying on the nitric acid hard. And this really hurt him by this stage. He was trying hard to denox that liquid. It just was not going well. I'm not sure he ever fully denoxed that liquid. He was getting a lot of strange precipitates forming. I suspect there was a lot of base metal sulfides there, maybe some copper sulfide and iron sulfides and other sulfides, because he went to Aqua Regia while there was still so much base metal in there, and that Aqua Regia was full of base metal, and he used a lot of SMB, produced a lot of sulfur dioxide, and I'll bet a lot of that base metal in there converted that sulfur dioxide into metallic sulfides, and that was probably a lot of the strange precipitates he was seeing. Plus, I think as he was denoxing this stuff and raising the pH of the liquid, I think what was happening was also he was getting a lot of the silver coming out of solution as silver chloride. Now, he had tested the liquid for the presence of silver, and he saw some. But rather than continuing with his nitric acid extractions to get the silver out, he went straight to Aqua Regia. And that was going to result in the production of silver chloride at some point. And a lot of the gray precipitate that he saw when he was trying to get the gold out, I think that was silver chloride. I think there was actually more silver there than he thought there was. His test for the presence of silver is, in my opinion, a little bit inaccurate, where he puts a little bit of hydrochloric acid into the solution to see if any silver precipitates out. The problem with that is that silver chloride is somewhat soluble in highly acidic solutions, but it is not soluble in neutral solutions. So what I normally do is I will put a little bit of hydrochloric acid in a large amount of water, and then I will drip a little bit of my test solution in there to see if it forms a white cloud that way, because the pH of that solution is a lot higher, and the silver chloride is much more willing to come out of solution and show you the white cloud effect. There may have been a lot more silver there than Sreetips thought. So yeah, his gold recovery, you could actually see a little bit of gold in the bottom of the beaker. He swirled it around, and the gold, being heavy, settled to the center of the beaker where the swirling was less intense, as heavy material will. And you could see it in the bottom of the beaker in the middle of a big bunch of gray stuff, which I think was probably mostly silver chloride. But he was not at all impressed with the amount of gold there, very frustrated with the amount of effort and time he'd put into it, and he basically just admitted defeat at this point. Which is a shame, because he was not that far off from doing it the same way I do it, which generally works. He was so close, so close. So if we look down here at silver recovery, yes, I recover the silver. I will take the stuff from the nitric acid extractions and I will cement the silver out of it on copper. Works great. And I always get at least a little bit of silver that way. Sreetips did not attempt to do any kind of silver recovery. But I think if he had just changed his processes a little bit, he would have gotten, a much larger amount of gold and enough silver to at least calculate a yield of silver too. So he was close. He was right, spot on the money up to the gravity separation, and he might have been able to do much better in spite of not doing the gravity separation if he had just done really good, thorough nitric acid extractions, several of them maybe. Yeah, these two things right here, these are what killed him, not doing these two steps. So if he had done them, or even if he had just, done a thorough couple of nitric acid extractions on that bulk material, I think he would have breezed down through here and recovered a much larger amount of gold. And then he could have taken that material from his nitric acid extractions and he could have cemented out some silver too. So he was so close, so close. It's just a matter of experience and trial and error. And like I said, there's been a lot of error with me. But I'm sure he will learn from this experience, and next time he'll be better prepared. So there we are. That's my analysis of what happened with Sreetips. I think, and I won't even call what he did errors. I would say he just missed a couple of steps along the way, a couple of crucial steps that if he'd taken, probably he would have succeeded. And, but like I say, it's a learning process. There's a lot of trial and error that went into what I do. And I'm sure if he decides to do them again, he'll do a better job of it. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think of this analysis of Sreetips problems with IC chips, and what you think of my process for handling IC chips. I know quite a few of you out there are following it successfully. I know Joe is. So, yeah, leave a comment. Let me know what you think. And thanks for watching. Subscribe to see my future videos. And if you like this video at all, give it a like, give it a thumbs up. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.